on Film Essentials, a discussion of classic cinema in suits. I'm Lincoln L. Hayes.
My name is David Metzger.
This week we are discussing Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, based on the novel of the same name, which reignited the Australian cinema. I was reading up on it, and it's just kind of insane. There just wasn't any cinema being made in Australia for the most part until the government came along and was like, we will give you money to make movies. And then they're like, okay. And then they just started making great films. Mm-hmm. And this being one of the first of that new wave in the 70s. Why did we pick this for this season?
This is one of those films, you know, it's not a quote-unquote classic film in the traditional sense.
Most people I mention it to go, what's that?
Yeah, right. And most people wouldn't know what it is, even it being a foreign film, even it being from Australia. Mm-hmm. It's nice to be able to sneak in one of these films because it does have kind of a cult status.
You say that as if anyone's going to say no to you. You present me with the thing, and I'm like, yep.
Sure.
But you snuck it in. You got it.
I snuck this in. This is kind of like it's like an underground film school film. People who go to film school, people who study films, people who love films know about it. But anyone outside of that trajectory, you'd be hard pressed to find if they know what it is, even if they know the book that it's based on.
Right.
But there's just something, when I saw it, it was just because, one, going through film school, at some point you hear about it, a teacher mentions it, or you're reading an interview with a director and they mention it as an influence. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point I was like, I got to get around to seeing this film.
Right.
And especially because it's Peter Weir and it's one of his first films.
Mm-hmm.
I love Witness, I love Dead Poets Society.
Truman Show.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So when Criterion released this big box set, it was like, I need it, and I will finally sit down and I will finally watch this film. Mm-hmm. And outside of it being, what is known about it is how mysterious it is and how beautiful it is and how it's just like kind of like this masterpiece of tone and imagery and mood, and that it's a mystery that's just presented as that. Yeah. And there's no answers. There's no part on the author's behalf, the director's behalf, to tell you what it is, what it means. It's just all very impressionistic. Mm-hmm. And even if the film wasn't, even if it wasn't worth the watch, and it wasn't that great of a film, and that first half hour was still intact, mm-hmm. I would still love it to death, because just the actual picnic is just one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on film.
It's photographed so beautifully.
It is an impressionistic painting. There's certain stills and images where you're just like, God, they either had an impressionist painting mm-hmm. right next door and they just copied it mm-hmm. perfectly, or they just soaked it up so much that they're just like, this is how we're going to position the actors. This is how the light's going to hit them. Mm-hmm. And there's a story from the cinematographer where he went to the actual site of Hanging Rock, and it was like just a regular location scout. And he's like, okay, we can only shoot for 30 minutes, and it's from this time to this time. Whoa. No matter what we're doing on a particular day, we've got to make time to travel to this site mm-hmm. And shoot for just this amount of time.
Right.
And you think of to be a director and be presented with that.
I'm sorry, what now?
Right.
So we're going to shoot this for 12 weeks now instead of 6? Awesome.
And you're probably like, if you're Peter Weir, if you're a director that's like, I want this particular look, you're like, okay, whatever it takes. Mm-hmm. And then you're actually doing it and you're like, good God, because I think it was
half-hour chunks. Oof.
Over the course of probably, I think it was, they said 5 or 6 weeks mm-hmm. of just shooting that.
That's insanity.
But then you see it and you're like, okay.
You're like, okay, I guess it was worth it.
It just is, and it's one of those it's one of those just see it movies. Like if someone was saying,
Perfect way to describe it.
what is this movie about?
Just see it. Just see it, and then we can talk about it.
Right.
Yeah. And that's exactly what you said to me going in. You said it's a very interesting film. It's a thinker. You're going to be pondering it afterwards, and yes, you do. You think about it, and it's, from the research that I got, the best way to describe this film is voyeuristic. We're just watching these girls. And then once the tragedy does happen and they do disappear, everything from then on out is personal interpretation. I've never seen a movie that is so much a choose your own adventure as this film. Like the events unfold, everything happens, but then when it's over, it's like, what do you think?
It's on you.
And you're like, I don't want to think. Stop it. And it like turns into this whole like Freudian thing of like projecting all of your, your fears and your insecurities onto what's happening to these characters. And it's like, you may think A, B, C, or D happened, and really that's just a reflection on you. It's like, well, if you think that, then why do you think that? And you're like, oh no, I'm being psychoanalyzed. But the performance is all great. It's absolutely gorgeous to look at. Some of the shots were achieved by putting an actual veil in front of the camera.
I love that stuff.
Cinematographers are so much smarter than me.
And
it's just like, wow, how do you do that? And it's just a bride's veil. Like, of course it is.
And on one of the making of features on this, like the cinematographers are talking, and he's like, yeah, I went to a bridal store and just asked for that material, the veil material, and he's like, they probably thought I was a lunatic because I wanted a certain amount, and said that it was for a film. But then, like, those are the types of things that I love, much like, in Bonnie and Clyde, when the guys like, get some window screen and throw it on top of the lens.
That's all you need.
That's all you need.
And then you're like, okay, and you put it on there, you go, yeah, oh, Jesus, yeah, that's it. That's exactly the look we're going for. Me and George Lucas used Vaseline. Other people use different elements, but a veil is both perfect for the look that it achieved, but also fits within the Victorian theme of the piece itself. Yeah. It's just like, what? That is so much forethought that I do not have. But let's jump into the story of it. It's about these high school-aged girls who are going to the Appleyard School for Young Women. It's basically an etiquette and what am I trying to say? Girls' school where they go and they get turned into ladies.
Yep. So like, you were on etiquette training, and
charm school kind of thing.
Oppressive.
Yes. Mrs. Appleyard, you can tell just by her hair alone, is not to be trifled with. And they are gifted this day where they're going to take a picnic out to Hanging Rock. And they are warned not to leave the group because it can be very dangerous. And once they get there, it's a hot day out in the bush, and a handful of the girls wander off on their own. One of the teachers goes with, and shortly thereafter, they just disappear. They're just gone. The only one to return is Edith, and she's hysterical, and can't remember anything that happened. And then, there's a massive search. Everybody's out there looking for them. They eventually find another one of the girls, Irma, right? She's missing her corset and also unconscious and doesn't remember anything once she does come to. And none of the others are ever found. And it's just this incredible mystery that no one can solve. The police can't figure it out. The teachers at the school can't figure it out. The girls don't know what's going on. Townspeople get involved. They can't figure it out. There's a boy who was nearby, Michael, I believe is his name, right? Who sees the girls just before they disappear. So obviously he's a prime suspect, but then he kind of gets obsessed with trying to figure out what's going on too. He goes out to the rock. He gets lost and disoriented and is found a day or so later, near death. And there's never any explanation as to what happens at all. And that's just it. And as soon as it's over, you push stop and turn the TV off, and you just sit there for a second and go, huh. And that's the next 2 days of your life.
Right.
So watch it and then clear away 2 days to just think about it, because that's how it's going to be. So I'm guessing the first time you saw this was college?
Yeah. It was much later, because it was, it was basically when they released the Blu-ray, and that's when I decided to, okay, I want to get this, and I want to sit down and I want to actually watch it, because it was just like hearsay from people who had seen it, or directors writing about it, and it's weird because you watch it and not only is it a mystery that we should probably say, spoilers within. If you haven't seen the movie, stop, watch the movie,
why
then
are you
watch our
watching
show.
these episodes if you don't know
Some
that?
people might. Some things you can do this way, but this one, we just spoiled it right from the top. But
yeah, it's a mystery, guys.
Not only is it a mystery that you're not going to get the answer, and you're not going to. There's no solution. There's no, you don't find out why it happened, how it happened, what happened. But something about the way Peter Weir directs it, and I'm sure this comes from the novel as well, is that whatever you think could happen, whatever possible explanation you could come up with, there is something in this film to support it. And whether that's just you reading into it or something that's actually presented, whether it be a sound or a line of dialogue that's spoken that could be interpreted, or just something that you see in the corners or in the background somewhere, there's something to support whatever you want to project onto it.
Right.
And there's a great story that Peter Weir tells in one of the documentaries, in that, so he is basically auditioning to be the director of this film. And he sets up a meeting with Joan Lindsay, who wrote the novel, and he's told by numerous sources, don't ask her what she thinks happened or what it's about, or just don't. So he has the meeting, they're getting along really well, and the meeting's coming to an end, and he's just like, Joan, I've been told not to ask you, but I can't get through this meeting without asking you. So what was it? What do you think happened? What is the answer? And she says, my dear boy, I like you and I want you to direct this film, but don't you ever ask me that ever again. And you hear something like that and you think, artsy fartsy stuff, like it's just someone who makes something and doesn't want to give any answers, just wants to leave it up to the audience and blah blah blah. But there is something to the mystery of this film that draws you in and sucks you in, and I still attest that if there was an answer at the end of this film, it would not be a satisfying film.
Because it wouldn't be the one you want.
No.
It's never going to be the one you want, because you inflate this in your mind to be something supernatural, something extraterrestrial, something any number of things. And if they were like, oh yeah, they fell in a hole, you'd be like,
right,
boo, boo movie.
Or even if they said like if they had like a shot of a spaceship coming down, or if they had, yes, it was some spiritual ghost or some ancient tribe that is still living in the caverns down there, and they came up and they scooped them up. What do you take from that, and
exactly.
What do you get from that? But when you start to read into it and you watch it a couple times and you're like, okay, they come from an oppressive school, so there's this sexual hysteria and sexual oppression and repression in this whole film, and specifically in that first chunk, in the actual picnic, so that when you start to think of it as, well, this is all a metaphor for sexual awakening, and that's where they disappeared to, and that's what the disappearance is all about, is that they're no longer going to be oppressed by innocence and being a quote unquote lady,
Yeah.
they're going to go off and they're going to be free and they're going to be one with nature.
Yeah. That's the most succinct way to put it. And it's about descending or ascending, depending how you look at it, into primitivism. Because, you know, here they are with their high-collared dresses and their gloves and their hats and their, you know, umbrellas and all that other stuff. And then as soon as they get there, the hats come off, the gloves come off, the stockings come off, the corsets come off.
Walking around barefoot.
And you're just like, what do you mean you're barefoot? What are you crazy?
Right.
It's like, well, yeah, they're returning to nature. There's something paganistic about this place. There's something that draws them in a primal level that they don't understand. And it is a perfect metaphor for a sexual awakening. Mrs. Appleyard even refers to the rock as a hymn, and it's very phallic in its shape and its nature, and it's very treacherous and full of snakes and all this other stuff. And conversely, once they get there, the rock itself almost represents female sexuality as well, because it's just full of crevices and caves, and the last time we see them, they're going into a very, very narrow space, and then they're gone. It's fascinating. Within the DVD, there is a fantastic essay called "From What We See and What We Seem" by Megan Abbott, and I wrote down a few choice segments that I wanted to mention about that. The film itself is about watching, looking, and about the gaze itself. It's very voyeuristic. When we start the film, we see the girls through mirrors as they're getting ready before the picnic, like looking at each other through doorways and kind of spying on each other in a weird, not quite sexual, but very excited, and you can tell that they're just on the brink of something. And there's a lot of Freudian stuff to be read into it too, but like you see all these girls, the way that they're acting with each other, you feel like at any moment there may be a sexual explosion. We have the scene where they're all putting their corsets on each other, and the one girl's bent over the window, and then another's doing hers, and another's doing hers, and it's very kind of suggestive in the way that it's shot and their interactions thereof. And it just, a lot of people didn't like this movie when it first came out because it does make you think a lot about yourself. Like whatever you're thinking about that, you then have to go, well, what does that mean about me? And there's a lot of self-reflection to be done after this film that a lot of people don't want to do, especially just going to the movies. You're like, oh, I just want to go to a movie. Then all of a sudden you walk out, and all of a sudden you're like, do I have an Oedipus complex? What's wrong with me? It's got a lot of levels to it. This is an onion movie for sure. There's a lot going on.
And one of the things, like, because you can read so much into it, you know, it's one of those films where, you know, whatever you think and whatever you want to read into it, yourself or I, like, we're not in the position to tell anybody that they're wrong.
Right.
But there's been a lot said about this film, because it is a woman's film.
Yeah.
But I think there's a mistake in thinking that it is, that you'd want to say, well, it's about women having a sexual experience with each other,
right?
And that it's a lesbian film.
Yeah.
I think that's a little reductive. I think it's just about sexual awakening.
Absolutely, is that reductive? That is taking an entire film and boiling it down to one
side
projection that then is projected back onto yourself. There's only one small moment in the film when there's even a suggestion of any kind of relationship between the characters, and it's Miranda and Sarah, and she just says to her, paraphrasing, "You're going to have to learn to love someone other than me."
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean sexual love.
No.
That's friendship. She's inviting her to her home. They're very close friends. Also, Sarah is an orphan and is now basically a ward of some random guy who's stopped paying her tuition, we find out. So to read into that is very reductive. I agree.
But at the same time, like, you know, a slice of dialogue like that could be interpreted is put there for that very purpose, so
Right.
that if that's what you want to see in it and that's what you want to take from it, there's something in the film to point you in that direction.
Yep. There are signposts everywhere of what it could be, and none of them point to a definitive answer. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating and frustrating film for that reason. Something else that I thought was interesting, Miss McGraw, who is one of the teachers, the one that actually disappears with the group, as they're headed towards Hanging Rock, the driver of the coach is kind of bragging a bit on the knowledge of what he knows about Hanging Rock. And then she counters, he says something like, oh, you know, it's a million years old or so. And she goes, really, that's not that old, if you think about the age of the Earth and all this other stuff. And she talks about how the lava is forced up from deep down below, and she kind of romanticizes the Hanging Rock as this, her being a middle-aged woman herself, who, you know, you can interpret it that she's past her prime and she's going to be an old spinster and all this other stuff. Whereas she sees this rock as something to aspire to, like, well, this thing's only a couple million years old. That's not that old in the grand scheme of things. I'm 35. That's not that old. People live to 60 these days, or, you know, whatever may have been the attitude of the Victorian time. And then to have that immediately countered with Appleyard talking about how oppressive it is, and, you know, treating it more like a masculine icon than a feminine icon and all this other stuff. So you have those two signposts as well, of like, it's feminine and ethereal, it's masculine and oppressive, and then you get there and it's a giant rock formation, and it's shot and presented in such a way in the film that you do start to believe that there's something there. And it's like, this is a rock. This is a rock formation out in the bush. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, you kind of get the tingles in the back of your head, and you're like, I don't know if I want to be here.
Right. And there's accounts from people who have been there that say that there is, you know, even if they don't know anything about this movie, mm-hmm. or have been told that there's something about it, that there is this eerie feeling once you get there. When you were just speaking about like those two mindsets, it's funny, like those are three stages of being a woman. Really, this is like the youth, and there's the middle age, and then there's the older. And if you're Appleyard, you know, you're oppressive, you're cold, you're distant, mm-hmm. you're closed off. And as you know, in the middle of that, you're looking and you're like, oh, I wish I could be young again so I could start again.
Right.
Or, you know, is my trajectory to be
Am I going to turn into whatever that hairdo is? Appleyard. Like, Google a picture of Mrs. Appleyard. It is one of the most insane hairstyles I have ever seen. And I was watching it, and Rachel came home at one point, and I was like, just look at this hair. She's like, what is happening? Because it's like pulled tight down through here, but then there's a big old bump thing on the back too. She looks like Bram Stoker's Dracula.
And you're right, like you see that hairdo and you're like, okay, I know everything about who this character is, yep. and what her place in this story is going to be. Mm-hmm. And I think they even mentioned that in the, like, that she hated wearing her hair like that, but that when she did and she saw herself, she was like, I am Appleyard now.
Yeah, I get this.
I know exactly what to do.
Mm-hmm. One of the takeaways from the essay that I really appreciated, they talk about how audiences initially were angry that there wasn't a climax to this film. There wasn't any resolution. One critic at the screening threw his coffee cup at the screen and said, "What the hell was that? That doesn't even have an ending. I just wasted 2 goddamn hours of my life." Mm-hmm. And sure, you can look at it that way, or you can think about it a little bit. And if you think about it a lot, then you start asking yourself a lot of questions. But one of the quotes that Abbott had in her essay was, Weir and Joan Lindsay, the author of the book, have failed to keep his end of the creative bargain. Weir refused any release. So we're all watching this film together. We're all experiencing this together, having our own questions and thinking our own, doing our own detective work. And then since there is no end, there's no catharsis. There's no like, aha, I was right, or that's not the ending that I thought it was. We're all just...
Right. And not even like a catharsis in any way, shape, or form.
No.
Like, you know, it would be one thing if, well, no, we don't get the answer to this mystery, but there's some resolution to one of the characters or,
Right.
or anything. And it's just not, it's just left there. And there's something, specifically as a student of film and as someone who aspires to become a filmmaker, it's like, to see a film like that and that it holds up and it's not to everyone's taste and not everyone is in full agreement that it's great, but that there's enough people there that do,
Yeah.
And that there is something that you can take from it. There's something very freeing about that you can, it's almost like anti-narrative, where you can say, okay, as long as I know why there's no resolution to this story, that's enough.
Right.
And
that's a perfect way to say it. Because we all know that there isn't an answer, that's enough of an answer for us to not hate the film.
Right.
If you can accept that.
Right.
If you can get behind that idea that there just isn't the end, then we're all kind of on the same page, and then it sparks a conversation. Then you can have a dialogue with somebody of like, well, what do you think it was? And those are my favorite conversations to have about film, when, sure, you can go back and forth and say, I think Jaws is great, I think Jaws is terrible. That's subjective. This is a mystery that you're trying to solve, and you can try to solve it together, but we all know that there's no answer. So it is kind of a fruitless endeavor, but that's part of the fun. So you're like, okay, what do you think happened? It's like when you're trying to guess how the end of a book series is going to be, or what's going to happen in the finale of a show, where you go back and forth and you talk about all your theories and your predictions and whatever, and then ultimately when it happens, you're either right or you're wrong. You're either pleased with it or you're not. And it's as if this were, Game of Thrones, and we just don't have the last season. It's just like, and it's over.
Right.
Well, what happens? That's up to you.
What do you think? Yeah, and there's, within the first act of the movie, like, you get to the end and you're like, well, if the filmmakers are smart enough, they won't give us an answer. There's a part of you that thinks that.
Yeah.
There's also a part of you that, like, my favorite example is Lost, because there's no other show that has been more exhilarating to watch, but to hold such disdain for it in retrospect, because they wrote themselves in such a corner, and that no, they didn't answer a lot of their questions, but even the ones that they did, it's like, was it very satisfying?
Right.
And I'm not sure if that it was.
And that's a prime example, because you watch the entire show trying to figure out the mystery, and that's why it's fun to watch, because you want to figure it out. You want to be the one to be like, oh, I knew that. Yes, I got it.
Right.
And then you get to the climax of the show and you're just like, no. Same thing with How I Met Your Mother. I mean, it's a different scenario and it's a comedic show, but the whole run of the show, we're waiting to learn who the mother is. And then once we do, they pull the rug out from under us and they have their final season, and it's garbage. And most fans of that show will agree that it's good up until a point, and then just don't bother watching the rest and just make up the ending in your own mind, because it's gonna be better than the ending that they gave you.
Right. And what's so great about watching this film, or going back and watching it again, is that if you are soaked up in the mystery and you want to, it's like, oh, I'm obsessed, I want to know the answer, I want to know, there's got to be something in here. You're watching the film like some of the characters in the film, of like I need to know. Tell us. There's got to be something in here. There's got to be a shot. There's got to be a moment that I missed. And
any moment that you think you do find, you could go to Peter Weir and be like, was it this? And be like, no, there isn't. Purposely, there isn't.
Let it go.
Yeah. Just go watch The Truman Show. You'll be happier. Another quote of Megan Abbott's that I thought was really interesting about what we're talking about, of trying to figure out the pieces of it. The film brings us face to face with our own self-generating projections, our shameful fantasies. So if you're like, oh, I think that they were kidnapped and raped.
Right. What
Well,
does that say about you?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I think it was aliens. Okay. Oh, I think it was time travel. Okay. Speaking of, I want to read to you. There's a chapter of the book that was cut, and it was later released as another novel with a series of essays. And thank God they cut it, because you read this and you go,
So she cut it from the novel before she published it? Okay.
She had another 12 pages of the novel. Her editor convinced her to cut it because it kind of undercuts the rest of the book. The chapter opens with Edith fleeing back in the picnic area while Miranda, Irma, and Marion push on. Each girl begins to experience dizziness and feel as if she's being pulled from the inside. A woman suddenly appears climbing the rock in her underwear, shouting, "Through!" and then faints. This woman is not referenced by name and is apparently a stranger to the girls, yet the narration suggests she is Miss McCraw. Miranda loses the woman's corset, loosens the woman's corset to help revive her. Afterwards, the girls remove their own corsets and throw them off the cliff. The recovered woman points out that the corsets appear to hover in midair as if stuck in time, and that they cast no shadows. She and the girls continue together. They then throw their corsets from the top of the cliff, but instead of falling, the corsets stand still in midair. The girls then encounter what is described as a hole in space, by which they physically enter a crack in the rock. The unnamed woman transforms into a lizard-like creature and disappears into the rock. Marion follows her, then Miranda, but when Irma's time comes, a balanced boulder, the hanging rock, slowly tilts and blocks the way. The chapter ends with Irma tearing and beating at the gritty face on the boulder with her bare hands. So
and that goes back to what we're talking about of, like, you know, if we were presented
is that
with that.
the ending that you want?
Right.
That it's a strange time warp, which explains all the clocks stopping.
Right.
Which actually Joan Lindsay has said that that's just something that happened to her a lot in life. Clocks would just stop around her. Like, she had some strange magnetism within her own body that she would stop clocks, which is crazy. That's not a thing that happens to a lot of people. But imagine if the film had ended like that. Like, we get Edith's account of it or Irma's account of it, and they're like, yeah, this woman showed up in her underwear, and then she turned into a lizard, and then we all went into a time hole.
Right. And, you know,
next week on Doctor Who.
And whatever her intentions were with that chapter of supplying any answers, you know, it's fun to think that it could be something metaphysical or something supernatural.
Sure.
But to be presented with that, for me, one of the problems with something like that is that there is a realism and a naturalism to everything that's in this story.
Yes.
And when you're presented with something that you know is not that, like, you know, whatever, who are we to say what is real or not, but in your own experience, you know there's not a person that's turned into a lizard.
Right.
And you know that there's no, like, corsets that suspend gravity or whatnot, and that cast no shadows. All those things, if it was presented in a fantasy film, you would accept it.
Right.
But if you're presented in a film that is maybe based on a true story,
right,
and you're presented with something that you know couldn't be, then it screws
loses
with
all
the
credibility.
logic and
It turns into like an uncanny valley thing, or like a, I don't know, there's terms in science fiction for it where it's just like, nope, that doesn't work.
Right.
We can't suspend our disbelief that much. Because, yeah, you've presented this true story, supposedly, and then all of a sudden there's a lizard woman and floating corsets, and you're just like, and you lost me.
Right.
Don't believe you anymore. So thank goodness they cut that out, because that would have been just such a bad ending. Oh, that would have been a bad ending. The actual location of Hanging Rock itself, it's a real place. And because of the book and because of the film, tourism to the area has increased significantly. However, a few years ago, there was a doctoral student named Amy Spires who started a movement called Miranda Must Go, to try to get people to stop making it such like a fantasy place because of the books. They're like, oh, we go there, maybe we'll disappear too. And she's like, no, there's a lot more history to this than just the made-up stuff from the film. There was a considerable amount of tragedy that happened there in life. and I wanted to read about that as well. It mostly has to do with the Aborigines of the area. At Hanging Rock, we've become obsessed with the myth, almost to the point where we sort of tell it as though it were a true story. But we completely ignore the true losses that have happened there. Most of the Aboriginal people living in that area died of smallpox or were murdered by colonists or removed by Coranderrk Aboriginal Reserve in Healesville in 1836. It's just fascinating to me that we keep choosing to be haunted by a fictitious story rather than the real losses that occurred at that place. So I can completely understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody coming along and being like, oh, this place is magical. And it's like, no, this, like, have some respect. Some actual bad stuff happened here.
Right.
A lot of people died. The president of Friends of Hanging Rock Association for preserving that area agreed with her and had this to say. For 40,000 years, Hanging Rock has brought people together, and Miranda in the film and the book are all part of that story. But a significant part of that story was to understand the indigenous history and further investigate the indigenous name. We focus on one aspect of popular culture around Hanging Rock, and I think what Amy is trying to do is tell a broader story, and we certainly support that. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, it is a real place, so people would go there. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many places have you gone to and been like, this is where they shot such and such?
Like
oh
everywhere
God.
I go.
This is the house where they did the thing. So people are going to Hanging Rock, and I guess they'll go to the top and they'll just yell Miranda.
Yeah.
And they're like, stop it. Stop doing that.
But, and that is just that's the power of films mm-hmm. in general. And it is, as a location, it is such a cinematic landscape, and you know why she chose it, mm-hmm. and you know why they just had to make the film there. And the only thing that I can really compare it to is Devil's Tower in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, mm-hmm. and they had the same type of thing. Like, I'm sure 90% of the time people are going there because of that film,
yep.
And they're going there because they want to see spaceships land.
Yep, and they want to break off a piece of it, and it's like, don't
do that.
Don't do that.
There's even like in the diary that Bob Balaban wrote when he was filming that Close Encounters, the park rangers were getting upset because people would go there and they would, want to take pictures there, which is fine, but then they'd want to feed the wildlife that is around there, and they're disturbing the natural order of the place. And at the same time, kind of similar to this, it's like they're going there for the film and because of a fantastical reason and not the actual history of the place.
So just have some respect, guys. That's all we say.
But it would be really cool to go to Devil's Tower because of Close Encounters. One day I will.
Hey, road trip, man. Do it. Personal tie-in to this film. Watching it, reading about it, and having all of this, like, there is no ending.
Hearing everyone's frustration
and
with
just
it.
being like, what is it about? What does it all mean? This is unintentionally exactly what I was trying to do with what Kent did. I had a story. It had an ambiguous ending. I had an ambiguous conflict in that Kent has done something, what Kent did. It is unknown what he's done, but he has to make recompense for that. That's this. These girls go, something happens, we don't know what it is, the end. That's what I was going for with my film. Did I succeed? I thought so. Apparently I did not. What do you think?
Well, it's up to,
It is
I knew
subjective.
I knew what you were going for.
Yeah.
It's like I said, like when the filmmakers, it's not just doing something just to do it or doing something just to be like, haha, I'm not going to give you the answer, and aren't I clever? It's, we knew what it was, and we tried to throw in little clues.
I don't think we have the exact same idea even what it was, but we have an idea what would cause this to happen.
Right.
And it could be a laundry list of things, but it's like it has to be something strong enough and bad enough to lead to the climax of that short film. And people just didn't get it. And so many people will just come up to me afterwards and be like, so what did he do? I'm like, that is for you to determine. What do you think he did that's bad enough to result in his fate? That's the point. And if you don't get it, then, sorry, I'm not going to spoon feed you in an 8-minute film. I don't have time.
I'm not asking for much.
It's 8 minutes of your life. Watch it and go, huh, I wonder what he did.
They grabbed 2 hours from you. I grabbed 8 minutes.
Exactly, 2 hours. Ugh, whatever. This has been, the novel anyway, has been adapted several times. I was interested to see that. It's been adapted for the stage in 1987. It was made into a musical that premiered in New York in 2012.
Which is weird.
Yeah, I can see it being a musical. I don't see it being a good musical though, because it's a very intellectual film. Musicals don't tend to be all that intellectual, and especially musical audiences don't tend to accept that kind of open-ended, what could it mean situations, because more often than not they're like, I want to be entertained.
Right.
You can get away with it with theater, for sure, because there's all kinds of experimental theater, but a musical I feel like would be really difficult to do. BBC Radio 4 did an adaptation in 2010, and right now, I believe it's already premiered, there's a miniseries starring Natalie Dormer of Game of Thrones, playing Mrs. Appleyard, which I read that and I was like, whoa, 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 she is way too young for that. And then I looked up how old she was and I was like, oh, well, I guess that would work. She just seems so young.
Right.
I mean, even when she was doing The Tudors, you're like, wow, how old are you? And she was in her 20s at that point. She's 35. Didn't know that. She's older than me.
That's old.
It is if you're Mrs. Appleyard. So if she's Mrs. Appleyard, then I didn't look at the rest of the cast. She's 35. She's Mrs. Appleyard. How old then is the French teacher, and how old is Miss McCraw in between?
Right.
She's 35, so Miss McCraw must be 30. Oh, what an old maid!
Perish the thought.
Yeah.
Just a little bit before we wrap up about the actual picnic, because there's such a. Like I said, like if the film wasn't anything to write home about, but it still had that first act intact, it's such an influential filmmaking masterclass in terms of style, mood. There is, I don't know if they ever tell you what the actual speed is, but they slowed down the film just a certain amount, and it's not a. There's something off about it, but you're like, it's not slow motion. It's not regular speed. It's somewhere in between.
It's like 1/10.
Right, and it's so
dreamlike.
Dreamlike, and this is like, and he does the same thing in particular sequences in Witness, where the only word I can use to describe it is it's such a sensual experience.
Yep.
And that's not to say, it's not about being sexual or about fantasy. It's just,
sensual, the sensuous.
And it's just, and it gives you just certain feelings.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, and I mean, Anne Lambert as Miranda.
Yeah.
No matter what you think, I mean, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
She's beautiful, and there are shots in this film where you're like, you are like the kid in that you're like, God, like them walking across the river or walking, hand in hand. It's like I gotta know, like I want to know that person.
You're drawn into it,
and that's what this film does in that entire first act, is just draw you in with this with that slow sensual speed and the lighting and the natural sunlight mixed with whatever lights they're using in the camera,
right.
And that they are presenting this impressionistic painting of an image, and the costumes and even the music. I mean,
that haunting flute score.
God, I mean,
oh man!
And nothing about like anything in this story is like, oh, I get it, I got it. Panpipes. We're gonna put panpipes on here.
Yeah.
And they do it, and it just works, and that adds to the flavor of it, and that. Like, that is the stuff that I continue to be influenced by, is that it's just about everything coming together to create one symbiotic mood.
Yeah.
And, not to get up on this soapbox again, but, the article that just came about Netflix, that all these classic films that they're just dumping because
nobody's
watching them. It's sad, because that is, if I was a film student right now, that 9 times out of 10, I would be going to Netflix to find something to watch. And, you know, like you said, like if you were writing what Kent did right now, and you watch this, it would spark so much.
I already have ideas.
Right? And
I've gotten encouragement from people. They're like, you should work with this. You should do more with it. And having watched this now, I have an idea of how to change the beginning to kind of satisfy some of those critics who are like, but what did he do to make it more specific but not answer the question?
And these films and all these classic films that sadly are falling, it's not that you have an obligation to watch these films or that they're old so they're great and you must watch them.
Right.
It's important in the development and the nurturing of a artistic creative mind.
Yeah. If you spend your entire film going live watching action movies and, you know, Kevin Smith or Quentin Tarantino movies, and that's all you ever watch, you're missing all of the rest of this. There's so much other film out there that they're influenced by. And you learn that. You learn, Tarantino's influence for this film was this film. So then you go watch that film and you're like, whoa, this just opened my whole mind. Like, imagine you didn't know spaghetti westerns and you saw Django or Hateful Eight. And then you're like, oh, he really likes spaghetti westerns. And then all of a sudden you watch all these spaghetti westerns. Like, I didn't know that these were there. Right. So then you get into Italian cinema or Spanish cinema, or you start watching earlier works of other people. And all of a sudden you're just broadened your mind to all of these things.
And
if they were all on Netflix for you to watch,
it would be so
you'd never leave your house.
Easy. And through doing that, somehow subconsciously you create your own backlog of influence.
Yeah.
So that when you're making movies, you're pulling from these resources. It's like, a friend of mine had a quote where he said that, because someone asked him, it's like, I want to be a filmmaker, so do I really have to watch movies?
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't write a novel without reading a novel.
Right.
So you can't make a movie without watching movies. Like there's a form and
it's a visual media. You have to see it and consume
what you're
it.
doing.
Yeah. That's crazy. Who is this person who said, do I need to watch movies?
I don't know. He dropped the class the next day. but no, it was, yeah.
All right, wrapping up. We're actually ending this episode a little bit early so that we can actually slate in what Kent did right after us, which is exciting. I just want to leave with Roger Ebert's quote about this film because I thought it summed it up perfectly. It is a film of haunting mystery and buried sexual hysteria.
Perfect.
The man was succinct, for sure. You can find this online for $3 at all the usual places, but I highly, highly recommend getting this. This is fantastic because not only does it come with the DVD, the Blu-ray, and this great book and the bonus features, but it also comes with the novel itself. So if you have the time, this is not very long. What is this, like 180 pages? This is 194 pages. You could burn through that in an afternoon. It's great. It's a thinker, and I'm very glad you picked it.
Just something I want to leave with in terms of film students out there or film lovers that want to know. Sofia Coppola loves this movie, and it's all over her film. So Virgin Suicides, Marie Antoinette, and even her new film, The Beguiled. You can see that. I haven't even seen The Beguiled, but what I've seen of The Beguiled is like, here it is. Ang Lee, just because of the sensual, metaphysical nature of his films, in particular Ice Storm and Brokeback Mountain. And then Damon Lindelof, who wrote Lost, he said that a particular season of The Leftovers was influenced by this. And just like anyone who loves all these unsolved mysteries, true crime shows that are so popular right now, I mean, that's this.
Yeah, my favorite murder fans. You dig this movie because it leaves you with a lot of questions. And it's fun to have these conversations because we know we're never going to get an answer. But all right, let's just get out the whiteboard and let's just come to some conclusions on our own. And it's fun. It's not a fun movie to watch, but it's fun to digest it and dissect it.
And talk about it.
Yeah. Next week, We are doing Gone with the Wind, which I have never seen. How have I never seen Gone with the Wind?
Right. Well, because it's 4 hours long.
That's why. That is it. And I've never found it anywhere. They never play it on TV. It's not on Netflix, anything like that.
Right.
But we are going to have a guest, and the guest is my lovely wife, Rachel Riendo Hayes. She'll be coming on to discuss it, and it's going to be a really fun episode.
All right. Okay. Well, without further ado, enjoy what Kent did.
Yeah. And for those of you watching this online, I'll put it on the Facebook page too. And those of you listening, find it online. It's on YouTube. So until next time, I'm Lakin L. Hayes.
I'm David Metzger.
See you next time.